Hey y'all, I'm going to do something I normally don't do. I'm going to go over a study that's a few years old, and I'll link it in the description. But it covers skin health, the sun exposure, skin cancer, things like that. And, the common myths and ideas people have regarding this. And mainly because when I did that Dr. Dre video, I mentioned how OCD she is with applying sunscreen. And so a lot of people are jumping in like, oh, you should be doing that anyway, skin cancer, blah, blah, blah. And there's research that shows, there's DNA damage, and so, you want to protect your skin that way from the sun if you don't want premature aging, things like that. But in regards to skin cancer, the research on it has been widely misunderstood, I think, and you could really argue both ways. But I'm going to get into it, and I figured I would just show pictures of my family because we've never been shy, to get out in the sun. As a matter of fact, my kids grew up, my daughter was brown, all the years growing up. So, as you'll see in these pictures, and my two younger ones, I think the middle one has only worn sunscreen like once in his life, and my baby has never worn it. And we go out in the sun a lot. But yeah, I think mainly like the way we see it is if you're going to be out all day directly in the sun to where you're going to burn, that's when you should apply some sunscreen maybe. And that's the only time, and that's what research shows, that, the burning is what causes damage. All right, so I'm going to jump right into it. The Risk and Benefits of Sun Exposure, 2016. Public health authorities in the United States are recommending that men, women, and children reduce their exposure to sunlight based on concerns that this exposure will promote skin cancer. On the other hand, data show that increasing numbers of Americans suffer from vitamin D deficiencies and serious health problems caused by insufficient sun exposure. The body of science concerning the benefits of moderate sun exposure is growing rapidly and is causing a different perception of sun, UV, as it relates to human health. Melanoma and its relationship to sun exposure and sunburn is not adequately addressed in most of the scientific literature. Reports of favorable health outcomes related to adequate serum 25D concentration or vitamin D supplementation have been inappropriately merged, so that benefits of sun exposure other than production of vitamin D are not adequately described. This review of recent studies and their analyses consider the risk and benefit of sun exposure, which indicate that insufficient sun exposure is an emerging public health problem. The review considers the studies that have been shown a wide range of health benefits from sun UV exposure. These benefits include, among other various types of cancer, cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's disease, dementia, myopia, and macular degeneration, diabetes, and multiple sclerosis. The message of sun avoidance must be changed to acceptance of non-burning sun exposure sufficient to achieve serum 25D concentration or higher in the sunny season, and the general benefits of UV exposure beyond those of vitamin D. Health authorities in the United States are currently advising the human sun exposure be reduced. At the same time, NAHNES data shows that 32% of Americans suffer from vitamin D insufficiency. In this paper, we review the current state of the science of the risks and benefits of sun exposure and suggest that public health advice be changed to recommend that all men, women, and children accumulate sufficient non-burning sun exposure to maintain their serum D levels at 30 nanograms per deciliter or more year-round. The first scientifically established health benefit of sun exposure was the discovery in 1919 that sunlight cured rickets. This was followed in 1924 up by the discovery that an inactive lipid in the diet and skin could be converted by UV light into an anti-rickettic substance. The identification of vitamin D occurred in 1931. The association between sun exposure and reduced cancer mortality in North America was identified in the 60s. And in the 80s, it was hypothesized that vitamin D was the protective factor. For most of the intervening years, Instead of pursuing further benefits of sun exposure, scientific inquiry focused on the health risks of sun exposure, especially melanoma and other types of skin cancer. Chemical sunscreens were developed in 1928. Avoidance of international sun exposure and use of chemical sunscreens persisted as the standard advice of physicians and health authorities for reducing the risk of melanoma and other forms of skin cancer. The risks of inadequate sun exposure have been largely ignored. Recently, however, scientific inquiry has increasingly turned to the benefits of moderate sun exposure and the public health risks of inadequate sun exposure. As far as the risks go, the mechanism of melanoma is unknown, but is believed to be linked to genetic factors. The principal identified non-genetic risk factor is ultraviolet radiation, UVR, exposure, and the relationship between melanoma and UVR is two-sided. Non-burning sun exposure is associated with a reduced risk of melanoma, while sunburns are associated with a doubling of the risk of melanoma. It has long been observed that outdoor workers have a lower incidence of melanoma than indoor workers. A 1997 meta-analysis found an OR of 0.86 for occupational sun exposure. So that's pretty interesting, I would say, that people that work outside in the sun have a reduced risk. Biologically, UVB is known to induce DNA damage through the creation of pyrimidine dimers, while UVA does so at orders of magnitude less efficiently. And so that would make sense why sunscreen blocks UVB instead of UVA. At least I think that's the case. Oxidative damage through the creation of free radicals occurs at all UVR frequencies. However, the human body has many defenses against such damage, including DNA repair mechanisms, cell cycle and growth inhibitions, reduce proliferation, enhances sensitivity to apoptosis, enhancement of cellular differentiation, and anti-inflammatory effects, many of which are related to vitamin D produced to exposure to UVB. So that's also interesting that these benefits, they come whilst being exposed to UVB and, through the production of vitamin D. So people like to say, well, you can just get vitamin D through your food. Your body doesn't care which way. But there are benefits, to getting it this way. Okay. With respect to sunburns, melanocytes are not replicating cells. So once DNA damage has occurred, it is necessary for cellular replication to take place for the possibility of unrepaired or misrepaired melanocytes to develop into malignant melanoma. Sunburns correspond with rare occasions of cell divisions and ensuing vulnerability to mutations in otherwise indolent melanocytes. With respect to chronic non-burning sun exposure, it is thought that production against sunburn and development of melanoma derives from photoadaptation or from the induction of higher levels of vitamin D, or possibly both. Vitamin D produced by UVB exposure is converted to the active form of vitamin D by its sequential metabolism in the liver to form the major circulating form of vitamin D, 25-hydroxy vitamin D, which is then converted in the kidneys to 125-dihydroxy vitamin D. Evidence suggests that vitamin D that is produced in the skin can also be converted in the skin to its active form, thereby enhancing DNA repair and lowering cancer risk. So that was one of the things I asked Dr. Dre how she gets her vitamin D, and she informed me that we can get vitamin D through the sun even though we're blocking UVB, and that's misunderstood. That she made it sound like it only comes from UVA, and that's not correct. I guess it can come from both. So I don't know. I wouldn't want to block either pathway, However, I would want to give my body the best chance to, synthesize vitamin D, because, most people are pretty low, even when they don't even realize it. The incidence of melanoma in the United States has increased dramatically from 1 per 100,000 people per year in 1935 to 23 per 100,000 per year in 2012. Various explanations for this phenomenon have been suggested, including diagnostic drift, depletion of the ozone layer, the widespread use of artificial UVR devices, and the proliferation of large windows in office buildings. None of these explanations is particularly satisfactory for the reason that none explain the steady increase in melanoma incidence since 1935. While sunburns have been associated with a doubling of melanoma risk, chronic non-burning sun exposure and outdoor occupations have been associated with reduced risk of melanoma. Indoor occupations such as professional, managerial, clerical, sales, and service workers grew from 25 to 75% of total employment between 1910 to 2000. 25% of Americans live on farms in 1930, whereas only 2% do so today. Indoor attractions such as air conditioning, television, computers, and the internet probably have led to Americans spending more leisure time indoors. The prevalence of sunburns is high and has been increasing, and serum 25D levels of the American public, a likely marker for sun exposure, are low and have been declining. A more plausible explanation for the rise in melanoma incidence since 1935 may be the continually increasing insufficient non-burning sun exposure and related increasing vitamin D insufficiency, and the increasing sun prevalence experienced by the American public over the same time period. Furthermore, epidemiological studies do not indicate any difference in melanoma risk based on the age at which UVR exposure occurs. Sunburns appear to be equally risky at any age. The public health messages of the past 50 years to avoid sun exposure and to use chemical sunscreens may have contributed to the rise in melanoma incidence. So once again, very interesting. We are clearly, obviously, spending more time indoors since, way back when people spent time on farms and working outdoors all the time. We're spending less time in the sun. And, melanoma rates are going up. And they're saying that's possibly due to the high increase of using sunscreen. So we don't have high vitamin D levels anymore. We don't have the ability, even when we do go into the sun, to get all the benefits from receiving UVB. We can find no consistent evidence that use of chemical sunscreens reduces the risk of melanoma. This study from 2011 found in a prospective study that there may be an association between sunscreen use and reduced risk of melanoma. However, since the participants were told they were participants in a skin cancer prevention trial and were questioned periodically during the trial on their use of sunscreen, the likelihood that they were significantly more diligent in applying sunscreen in accordance with the manufacturer's instructions than ordinary users of sunscreen cannot be discounted. In addition, the study took place in a tropical environment, differing significantly from the environments of North America and Europe. Use of a placebo sunscreen was barred by ethical concerns. Sunscreens do, however, reduce acclimation to UVR and vitamin D production in the skin. Since public health authorities recommend liberal use of sunscreens for good health, the labeling of sunscreens should contain a statement about the possibility of vitamin D deficiency that may result from excessive use of sunscreens. Labeling should also state that sunscreens have not been shown to be effective in reducing the risk of melanoma. Then they go on to talk about, I'm not going to read all this because it just goes over a bunch of studies and what a bunch of different studies found. And they're talking about basal cell carcinoma and squamous cell carcinoma. And to sum it up, the Preventive Services Task Force in May 2012 final recommendation statement on skin cancer counseling stated that studies that measured long-term or total sun exposure had found no association between cumulative sun exposure and either SCC or BBC. So, as I said, I'll leave the study in the link, and you can go through and read, You can go back and read the studies they reference if you want to. Okay, so now we're going to jump into the benefits and the risks of inadequate sun exposure. Scientific inquiry into the benefits of sun exposure languished for many decades following the observation in the 1920s that farmers in Europe developed non-melanoma skin cancer on their most sun-exposed areas: ear, face, nose, and backs of hands. Research on the benefits of sun exposure has accelerated in the past 15 years, and particularly in the past 5 years. Biological plausibility. Vitamin D is a hormone, and most cells and organs in the human body have a vitamin D receptor, which explains the wide variety of diseases and disorders that have been linked to vitamin D insufficiency in epidemiological studies. The production of vitamin D by UVB radiation, the availability of vitamin D in food and supplements, and the biological plausibility of vitamin D as a mediator for a larger variety of favorable health outcomes are well described in the literature. There is considerable controversy within the scientific community regarding optimum 25D levels for human health. In 2010, the Institute of Medicine defined vitamin D deficiency as 25D, as less than 12 nanograms per deciliter, and vitamin D insufficiency as 25D of less than 20 nanograms. In 2011, the Endocrine Society defined vitamin D deficiency as 25 below 20 nanograms, and vitamin D insufficiency as, says the same thing. Others have suggested even higher levels. A letter signed by many respected vitamin D scientists and physicians recommended 40 to 60 nanograms, which is in line with what the Endocrine Society recommended as the preferred range for health. Most reference laboratories have raised the lower boundary of the normal range to 30. Okay, so according to the Endocrine Society's definition of vitamin D sufficiency, it has to be 30 or higher. So going by that, they say that the vitamin D deficiency in the U.S. increased from 55% to now 77%. And so that ends up being the majority of Americans are now deficient in vitamin D. That's crazy. So now to all-cause mortality. This 2014 study performed a meta-analysis of data from 73 cohort studies with 849,000 participants and 22 randomized controlled trials with 31,000 participants. This study found an inverse association of circulating D levels with risks of death due to cardiovascular diseases, cancers, and other causes. 1.3595% for all-cause mortality, comparing the bottom third versus top two-thirds of baseline circulating D distribution, but found that with respect to possible benefits of vitamin D supplementation, further investigation is required before any widespread supplementation occurs. The prevalence of vitamin D insufficiency, defined of course as 25 or less, was found to be, or less than 30 nanograms, was found to be 69.5% for the United States and 86.4% for Europe. The authors further estimate that 9.4% of all deaths in Europe and 12.8% in the United States could be attributable to vitamin D deficiency. Other meta-analyses include this 2014 study who pulled the data from 32 studies, 30 cohort, and 2 nested case control studies that examined age-adjusted all-cause mortality and serum D levels, and found that the overall age-adjusted hazard ratio for all-cause mortality, comparing the lowest group to the highest, indicating that individuals in the lowest group had nearly twice the age-adjusted death rate as those in the highest quintile, and conducted a meta-analysis of 8 cohort studies with 26,000 participants and found a 1.6-fold higher all-cause mortality in the bottom quintile compared with the top quintile. And this other study assessed the avoidance of sun exposure as a risk factor for all-cause mortality for 29,518 Swedish women in the prospective 20-year follow-up of the melanoma in southern Sweden cohort, and found that the population attributable risk for all-cause mortality for those habitually avoiding sun exposure was 3%. As compared to the highest sun exposure group, the all-cause mortality rate was doubled. Among avoiders of sun exposure, it increased by 40% in those with moderate exposure. The authors noted that Sweden has national guidelines providing restrictive advice on sun exposure habits in order to lower the risk of skin cancer, and stated that these guidelines may be harmful in terms of overall health of the population. And this 2016 study found that women with active sun exposure habits were mainly at lower risk of cardiovascular disease mortality and other non-cancer mortality, and noted that avoidance of sun exposure is a risk factor for death of a similar magnitude of smoking. Our finding that avoidance of sun exposure was a risk factor for all-cause death of the same magnitude as smoking is novel. End quote. Okay, so let's see. I'm not going to go through each of these studies because they're going over quite a bit here. But basically, it's showing that those with lower vitamin D seem to be, they have more cancer, they have more all-cause mortality. Okay, so this study is like 61 pages. It's pretty lengthy, and I'm not going to read everything, but they're talking about colorectal cancer, breast cancer incidence and mortality, and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, multiple sclerosis. All of these are showing bladder cancer, cardiovascular disease, metabolic syndrome. It seems like vitamin D deficiency, is a common denominator in a lot of these, and obviously that makes sense. Okay, so looking at Alzheimer's disease and cognitive decline, there's this one study that studied a group of 1,658 Americans aged 65 and older who were able to walk unaided and who were free of dementia. The participants were followed for 6 years to investigate who went on to develop Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia. The investigators found that participants with serum levels lower than 10 were double. Let me read that right, hold on. More than twice as likely to develop Alzheimer's disease than participants with 25 and higher levels. And participants with serum 25 levels of 10 to 20 were 69% more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease than participants with serum levels greater than 20. Similar results were obtained for all-cause dementia. According to the authors, this was the first large prospective population-based study incorporating a comprehensive adjudicated assessment of dementia and Alzheimer's to examine their relationship with vitamin D concentrations. This study confirms other recent studies linking low vitamin D levels with cognitive decline. In 2013, manipulated vitamin D status in middle-aged to old-age rats by dietary supplementation with low, moderate, and high levels of vitamin D. The results suggested that dietary vitamin D deficiency contributes to significant nitrosative stress in the brain and may promote cognitive decline in middle-aged and elderly humans. In this other systematic review and meta-analysis finding that D levels were lower in Alzheimer's cases than in controls, which means that the probability is about 140% that an individual without Alzheimer's would have a higher vitamin D, higher than 25 level than an individual with Alzheimer's if both individuals were chosen at random in the population. So that's pretty, significant, I would say. Well, we got macular degeneration. There's a association there. Dental caries. It's found that, children with cavities have lower D levels. And then we get to reverse causation. This 2014 study suggested that low serum levels may be the result rather than the cause of diseases associated with low serum levels in observational studies. The authors offer little evidence to support such a hypothesis, and it is contraindicated by the prospective nature of many of the studies linking serum D levels with health outcomes by randomization studies, and by the body of knowledge concerning the bioactivity of vitamin D, particularly its cancer inhibiting properties. Now, looking at obesity, there's an association here as well, and they've actually found that vitamin D being, synthesized from the sun had an effect, whereas supplementation of vitamin D did not on obesity. So there's also been an association with deficiencies in serotonin, which has been linked from everything from sudden infant death syndrome to depression, Alzheimer's disease, you name it. Beta endorphin, which is a neurohormone that has been known for many years to be released in the human body by exercise, and it produces a feeling of well-being similar to the feeling of well-being induced by sun exposure. A recent study showed that UVR exposure significantly raised circulating plasma endorphin levels in a UV exposure mouse model, leading to suggestions that UVR exposure is addictive. Alternatively, the release of endorphins by sun exposure could be a natural reward mechanism encouraging sun exposure. So, yeah, I noticed this myself. When I'm feeling a little bit down and I get out, we go to the creek or something, and when, we're out there for at least 10, 20 minutes or so, I start immediately feeling better, more uplifted. So they go on to say how vitamin D supplementation is not an adequate substitute, of course. And then talking about the amount of sun exposure required to produce levels above 25 varies among individuals and according to time of year, time of day, and latitude. White people in type 2 skins at 40 degrees latitude can obtain their annual requirements of vitamin D by spending about 15 minutes in the sun with face, arms, and legs exposed. Half that time if in a bathing suit, 2 to 3 times a week between 11 a.m. and 3 p.m. during the months of May through October. In comparison, non-melanoma skin cancer is associated with tens of thousands of accumulated hours of lifetime sun exposure. Moreover, inadequate acclimatization of UVR in daily life carries the risk of sunburn and corresponding increased risk of both non-melanoma skin cancer and melanoma. The risk of inadequate non-burning sun exposure include increased risk of all-cause mortality and just numerous other diseases that I'm not going to list. People with darker skins require more time in the sun to produce their requirements of vitamin D, but also have lower risk of non-melanoma skin cancer, and people with type 1 skins who are unable to tan require less time in the sun but have higher risk of non-melanoma skin cancer. All persons should avoid sunburns, which are associated with substantial increased risk of melanoma and non-melanoma skin cancer. Now, in conclusion, the insufficient sun exposure has become a major public health problem, demanding an immediate change in the current sun avoidance public health advice. The degree of change needed is small but critically important. The public must be advised to obtain enough sun exposure and vitamin D supplementation to maintain a serum D level of at least 30. The skin has a large capacity to produce vitamin D, and a single whole body exposure to an amount of sunlight that is equal to one minimal erythritol dose is equivalent to ingesting approximately 15 to 20,000 IUs of vitamin D. Therefore, to produce an equivalent of 4,000 IUs of vitamin D a day would require that 50% of the body's surface be exposed to 0.5 MEDs. To achieve a blood level of at least 30 nanograms would require ingesting 2,000 IUs of vitamin D daily, which would be equivalent to 25% of the body surface exposed to 0.5 MEDs 2 to 3 times a week. And then they go on to say the amount of sun exposure depends on skin pigmentation and latitude and time of day and year, and warnings and dangers about sunburn should be emphasized. So yeah, I think that's a pretty significant point right there. You know, our skin has this huge capacity to produce vitamin D, so why would we not utilize that? It doesn't even make sense. And I know people hate the appeal to nature or whatever, but I mean, just logically, just common sense would tell you that, you know, our ancestors didn't live in caves and were like, oh, we can't come out right now because we'll get wrinkles, we'll get some fine lines, we'll get skin cancer. No, they did what they did, and they, you know, synthesized vitamin D. They ate foods with vitamin D, and they didn't have to worry about all this nonsense. So, yeah, I think there can be a lot of modern explanations as to why, you know, the increased risk of skin cancer. As the papers stated, you know, people that work outside have lower rates. So, you know, the evidence doesn't really stack up in sunscreen's defense. But, you know, and then likely people are burning when they are not using sunscreen, or they're using sunscreen so much that they do end up burning because they're not used to getting sun exposure, things like that. Vitamin D is low, so that's going to put you at high risk of everything, basically. So, yeah, take of it what you will, and as for me, I'm not scared of the sun. I never will be. I think overall health is more important. Alright, see y'all later. Have a blessed day.